The promise of the eternal night was that nothing ever truly changed. The moon, a silver sickle in the ink-black sky, was the same moon that had watched Kaelin ascend to his blood-anointed throne 3 centuries ago. The stones of the citadel, cold and unforgiving beneath his boots, held the same chill. And the silence, the vast, profound silence of a king who had outlived every mortal heart he had ever known, was the most constant companion of all. It was a lie, of course. Everything changed. He changed. The silence was not a companion but a cage of his own making, and the cold of the stone was nothing to the frost that had claimed the core of him 112 years ago. Tonight, that cold was a living thing, seeping from the marble floors of the throne room, through the soles of his boots, and into his static heart. He sat upon the obsidian throne, a shard of a fallen star carved into the shape of power, and surveyed the supplicants. They were a predictable collection of human nobles and vampire courtiers, their concerns as ephemeral as their mortal lives or as repetitive as their immortal ones. A trade dispute. A border skirmish. A request for a royal charter. He listened with one part of his mind, the part that was the king of Ethel, the unseen hand, the night's sovereign. The rest of him was adrift in the long, grey sea of his own memory. Then, she was announced. Elara of Silverwood, royal cartographer, summoned to present the revised Western March charts. The name meant nothing. A common name. The village, Silverwood, pricked at something, a ghost of a memory, a scent of pine and wood smoke, but it was a phantom, gone before he could grasp it. He inclined his head, a gesture of bored permission, and watched her approach. She moved with a quiet grace that was at odds with the cavernous, intimidating space. The throne room was designed to diminish, to make all who entered feel small beneath the weight of history and power. But she did not seem diminished. She carried a heavy, leather-bound portfolio under one arm, her head bowed not in supplication but in concentration, as if navigating the polished floor was a task requiring her full attention. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, a cascade of russet and gold pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She wore the simple, practical woolens of a scholar, the deep blue a stark contrast to the pale cream of her skin. She stopped at the prescribed distance, sinking into a curtsy that was correct but not servile. When she rose, she kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere to the left of his throne. This was not unusual. Most humans could not bear to meet his gaze for long. It was the weight of his age, they said. The things he had seen. It tended to unmoor them. You have the charts, he stated, his voice a low resonance that carried without effort in the acoustically perfect hall. It was a voice he had cultivated, devoid of warmth, devoid of feeling. The voice of a monument. She nodded, a single, concise movement. She did not speak. Instead, she moved to a large oak table that had been cleared for this purpose, placing the portfolio upon it. Her hands, he noticed, were steady as she undid the leather ties. They were slender hands, elegant, but the knuckles were smudged with ink, the nails trimmed short and practical. A scholar's hands. She unrolled the first map, a magnificent, sprawling thing drawn on vellum, the lines impossibly fine, the calligraphy a work of art in itself. She used small, polished stones to weigh down the corners. The silence stretched. He had given her an opening to speak, to explain her work. She had not taken it. This, too, was unusual. Humans were often desperate to fill the silence in his presence, to chatter away their nerves. Explain the revisions, he commanded, a sliver of impatience sharpening the edge of his tone. She turned to face him fully for the first time. And his breath, a useless, reflexive action he had not needed for centuries, caught in his throat. It was not the face he remembered, not exactly. Time had sharpened the soft curve of her jaw, etched faint lines of concentration at the corners of her eyes. But the eyes themselves, they were the same. The color of moss after a rain, deep and green and impossibly familiar. A ghost from a life he had buried under a mountain of duty and regret. Elara. The name was no longer common. It was a key, and it had just unlocked a door in his mind he had spent more than a century fortifying. A door that opened onto a sun-drenched meadow, the scent of wild chamomile, and the sound of a young girl's laughter. His composure, the bedrock of his reign, fractured. He could feel the eyes of the court upon him, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. He had not moved, had not so much as blinked, but the air around the throne had grown thin and brittle. She saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew she did. A flicker of something, pain, fear, a sorrow so old it was part of her bones, passed through her own gaze before she masked it, lowering her lashes. She turned back to the map, her shoulders rigid. Then, she began to move her hands. The gestures were fluid, precise. One hand would form a shape, the other would slice through the air, her fingers dancing in a silent, intricate language. She was signing. She was explaining the revisions, her hands carving words out of the empty air. A court translator, a withered old vampire named Lucian, stepped forward from the shadows. "Your Majesty," Lucian began, his voice a dry rustle, "the cartographer indicates that the River Skoll has shifted its course by nearly a half-league since the last survey, rendering the old borders obsolete. She has charted the new riparian boundaries, which will impact the land tithes for the baronies of." Kaelin did not hear the rest. His entire being was focused on her hands, on her face, pale, composed, a mask of professional calm, and on the impossible fact of her presence. Ilara. Alive. Here. After all this time. He had assumed she was dead. He had forced himself to assume it, had buried her memory with the thousands of others he had lost to the merciless march of time. He had told himself she had lived a full, happy human life and died in her bed, surrounded by children and grandchildren. It was the only way he could have endured the choice he had made. The night he had left her came rushing back, not as a memory but as a visceral, present-tense reality. The smell of the coming storm. The desperate, pleading look in her eyes as he told her he had to go. The lie he had told her that he would be back in a week. The weight of the crown he had not yet worn, and the political marriage he had to forge to stop a war that would have burned her village, and 1,000 others, to ash. He had chosen the kingdom over the girl. He had told himself it was the only choice a king could make. He had left her in a cottage at the edge of the Silverwood, promising to return. He had sent men, of course. His most trusted guard to watch over her from a distance until he could extricate himself from the web of his new duties. But they had failed. A message had reached him 3 weeks later, delivered to him in the cold, foreign court of his new bride. A rogue pack of ghouls, drawn by the scent of a coming war, had swept through the outlying villages. Silverwood had been hit. The cottage was a ruin. There were no survivors. He had not allowed himself to grieve. He had built a wall around that memory, brick by painful brick, and had become the king his people needed, cold, decisive, and utterly alone. And now, here she was. The ghost had stepped out of the grave of his memory and was standing before him, her hands telling a story about riverbeds and boundaries while her eyes held the story of a far greater devastation. Lucian finished his translation. Ilara's hands came to a rest. She stood, waiting. The entire court was waiting. He was the king. He was supposed to speak, to pass judgment on the maps, to dismiss her. But the words would not form. The monument was cracking. "Leave us," he said. The words were stone, but there were fissures in them. A murmur went through the court. A private audience with a cartographer was unheard of. But no one disobeyed. Courtiers and nobles, vampires and humans, bowed and melted away, their curiosity a palpable force left hanging in the air. Even Lucian hesitated for a moment before bowing low and backing out of the chamber, his ancient eyes filled with a question Kaelin could not answer. The great bronze doors boomed shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. It was just the two of them now. King and subject. Monster and memory. He rose from the throne, the movement slow, deliberate, as if he were testing limbs he was no longer sure he could control. He descended the 3 shallow steps and crossed the marble floor, the sound of his boots unnaturally loud. He stopped a few feet from the table, from her. She did not look up. Her gaze was fixed on the map, on the fine blue line of the River Skoll. "Ilara," he said. Her name was a ruin in his mouth. She flinched, a small, barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. It was the first sign of weakness, the first crack in her own formidable composure. She did not look at him. She simply stood, her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. He took another step. He could smell her scent now, not the cloying perfume of the court ladies, but something clean and real. Ink, old paper, and the faint, heartbreakingly familiar scent of chamomile that seemed to cling to her skin like a memory. "I thought you were dead." The confession was torn from him, a raw, ragged thing. She finally lifted her head, and her moss-green eyes met his. There was no hatred in them. That, he thought, would have been easier to bear. There was something far worse. A deep, quiet, and ancient pain. An exhaustion that went bone deep. She lifted a hand, not to sign, but to the delicate column of her throat. With one finger, she traced a line just below her jaw. He had been so lost in her eyes, he hadn't seen it. Hadn't allowed himself to see it. It was a scar. A pale, silvered line against the cream of her skin, thin as a thread but stark in its declaration of violence. It puckered slightly near her ear and disappeared into the high collar of her tunic. It was a scar that had been meant to kill. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, an animal noise of pure agony. The wall he had built around that night, around her, did not just crack, it disintegrated. It turned to dust, and the full, undiluted horror of his failure washed over him. The Gowls. The attack. She hadn't died. She had survived. She saw the look on his face. Her expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like pity. Then she returned her hand to her side. She was not a victim seeking retribution. She was a woman presenting a fact, a cartographer showing him a truth on a map he had refused to read for over a century. What? His voice failed him. He swallowed, the motion feeling alien. What happened? She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that was louder than any words. In her eyes, he saw the fire, the screaming, the tearing claws. He saw a young girl, barely 17, left alone in a cottage, waiting for a man who had promised to return. Then, she turned back to the table. She picked up a piece of charcoal from a small pouch at her belt and, on a blank corner of the vellum, in a script as elegant and precise as the lines on the map, she began to write. "They came after you left. The men you sent were brave. They died first." The words were a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his chest as if he could hold his frozen heart together. The men you sent. He had sent them to protect her. He had sent them to their deaths, and hers. He had failed everyone. His knees gave out. The king of Ethel, the night's sovereign, who had faced down armies and ancient terrors, collapsed. He did not fall gracefully. He crumpled, his body folding in on itself, and landed hard on the cold marble floor. The sound of his body hitting the stone was pathetic, a sack of immortal flesh and unbearable guilt. He knelt there, his head bowed, his hands braced against the floor, the polished surface reflecting a fractured image of a broken man. He could not look at her. He could not bear to see the rest of the story she was writing. He stared at his own hands, at the long, pale fingers that had signed treaties and death warrants with equal detachment. The hands that should have protected her. The hands that had abandoned her to hell. A choked sound, half sob, half growl, tore itself from his throat. The silence he had cultivated for so long was shattered by the sound of his own undoing. The cold that had been his shield for a century was gone, replaced by a fire, a raging, agonizing inferno of guilt that threatened to consume him whole. He had thought himself a king, a martyr who had sacrificed his own happiness for the greater good. He saw now that he was nothing but a coward and a fool. A monster who had created a tragedy far greater than the war he had sought to prevent. Ilara watched him. She did not move, did not make a sound. She simply stood by the table, the piece of charcoal still held loosely in her fingers, and watched the king fall apart. Her face was a study in stillness, her green eyes holding the reflection of a man kneeling in the ruins of his own making. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction. There was only the vast, quiet landscape of a sorrow that she had lived with every day for 112 years, a sorrow he was only just beginning to comprehend. The eternal night had promised that nothing ever truly changed, but in the space of a single heartbeat, as he knelt before the ghost of his greatest failure, Kaelan understood that everything had changed forever. The throne room was a tomb, and he was its only occupant. The great bronze doors remained sealed, the tapestries depicting ancient victories hung like silent, mocking judges on the walls. Ilara had gone. After he had collapsed, after the first raw, animal sound of his agony had ripped through the chamber, she had simply left. She had placed the charcoal neatly beside her written words, rolled the precious maps with a care that seemed obscene in its normalcy, and walked out through a small, private door behind the throne, her footsteps making no sound on the stone. She had left him there, kneeling in the wreckage. It was a mercy. He knew it was. Her presence would have been an unendurable accusation. Her pity, an even greater torment. He stayed on the floor for a long time, the cold of the marble a welcome, grounding pain. Time had ceased to have meaning. Minutes or hours could have passed. The moon would have traced its slow arc across the sky, indifferent. His body, an instrument of perfect, immortal control, was trembling. A fine, violent tremor that started in his hands and radiated through his entire being. It was the shock of a soul that had been shielded for a century, suddenly laid bare to the elements. He finally pushed himself to his feet, his limbs feeling heavy, disconnected. He walked, not to the throne, but to the table where she had worked. Her message was still there, stark against the creamy vellum. They came after you left. The men you sent were brave. They died first. He traced the words with a shaking finger. The script was beautiful, controlled. The hand of an artist. The hand of a survivor. He looked again at the scar he had seen on her neck, the silvered line that bespoke a blade's edge. His mind, a cruel and efficient engine of torment, supplied the rest. He saw it all. The splintering door. The snarling faces of the Gowls, their hunger a tangible thing. The short, brutal fight as his guards were overwhelmed. And Ilara, alone in the firelight, facing the unimaginable. And her hands. Her silent, articulate hands. Why did she sign? The scar on her throat was the answer. It had not just marked her. It had stolen her voice. The laughter he remembered, bright and clear as a spring morning, was gone forever. Murdered. And he had been its accomplice. A wave of nausea, a purely psychological echo of a long-forgotten human sensation, rolled through him. He braced himself against the table, his knuckles white. He had to know. He had to understand the full scope of his failure. It was the only penance that felt real. He strode from the throne room, his movements stiff, mechanical. The guards outside the doors flinched at the sight of him. His face, usually a mask of regal indifference, must have been a horror to behold. He ignored them, sweeping down corridors of cold stone and colder memory, his destination fixed in his mind, the royal archives. The archives were his domain, a labyrinth of knowledge stretching deep into the foundations of the citadel. It was tended by a handful of ancient, dust-dry vampires who cared more for history than for the living. He found the section he was looking for, provincial records, early reign. He pulled down the heavy ledger for Silverwood and the surrounding territories, the year of his ascension. His hands were no longer trembling. They were rigid with purpose. He found the reports from his captain of the guard. He had read them at the time, of course, but through a haze of political maneuvering and the suffocating presence of his new queen. He had read the words, but he had not absorbed their meaning. He had not allowed himself to. Now, he read them as if for the first time. Gowl pack activity confirmed. Unusually organized. Outpost at Silverwood overrun. Total loss of life. The cottage of the girl, Ilara, burned to the ground. No survivors found. Regret to report the loss of Sergeants Heston and Rorick. Heston and Rorick. He remembered their faces. Good men. Loyal. He had sent them to their deaths. He closed the ledger, the sound a dull thud in the oppressive silence of the archive. No survivors found. They had been wrong. Or she had hidden. She had crawled from the wreckage of her life, from the embers of that cottage, and somehow, she had survived. How? How had a 17-year-old girl survived an attack that had killed 2 of his best soldiers? How had she lived for 112 years, carrying that night with her, while he sat on his throne, encased in his cold, ignorant grief? He left the archives and went to his private chambers. He did not light the lamps, preferring the gloom. The moonlight that slanted through the high-arched window was thin and pale, washing the color from the room. He stood before a silver-backed mirror, a relic from his human life, and stared at his own reflection. He saw the face of a king. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the color of a winter sky. It was a face built for portraits and coins, a symbol of eternal strength. Tonight, he saw only the monster beneath. The selfish, callow boy who had made a promise he never intended to keep. The arrogant king who had believed his sacrifice was noble, when it was merely an act of profound, world-altering cowardice. He had not sacrificed his happiness. He had sacrificed her. He wanted to smash the mirror, to shatter the image of the lie he had become. But the violence felt cheap, theatrical. His punishment would not be so simple. His punishment was the memory of her moss-green eyes, not filled with hate, but with a sorrow so deep it had become a part of her. His punishment was the image of her slender fingers tracing the scar that had stolen her voice. He had to see her again. It was not a desire, but a compulsion, a desperate need to stand in the presence of the truth he had evaded for so long. He did not know what he would say. Sorry was a pathetic, meaningless word. It could not rebuild a life, or restore a voice, or erase a century of pain. But he had to face her. He had to look at the world he had broken and acknowledge his role as its destroyer. The next day, he sent for her. Not with a formal summons to the throne room, but with a quiet request, delivered by a page, for her to attend him in the royal library. He waited for her there. The library was the one place in the citadel that felt alive to him. It smelled of paper and leather and time, a scent he had always found comforting. Today, it smelled of dust and decay. He stood by a window overlooking the central courtyard, watching the pale winter sun fail to warm the stones. When she entered, he felt her presence before he saw her. The air in the room shifted, became heavier. He turned. She stood just inside the doorway, her map portfolio held in front of her like a shield. She wore the same simple blue tunic, her russet hair tied back. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. She gave a slight, formal nod. She did not approach. She waited, a silent, immovable object. He gestured to a table near the fire. "Please." She hesitated, then walked to the table and set down her things. She remained standing. He was the king. He was used to commanding a room, to people following his lead without question. With her, he had no authority. He was a debtor before his creditor, and his debt was incalculable. "I read the reports last night," he began, his voice low, stripped of its usual regal cadence. "The official reports. They said there were no survivors." Her eyes, which had been fixed on the fire, flickered towards him. She lifted her hands. The movements were small, hesitant at first, then gained a fierce, sharp clarity. Kaelin's breath hitched. He did not understand the language of her hands, but he understood the emotion behind it. He saw the anger, the grief, the sheer, incredulous story of survival being told in the space between them. It was a ballet of remembered terror. He could almost see the fire, smell the blood. He cursed his own ignorance. He was a king who could speak a dozen languages, who could read ancient texts forgotten by mortal man, but he could not understand the one language that mattered more than any other. He was deaf and blind to her truth. "I don't understand," he said, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. "I cannot understand what you are saying." A bitter, ironic smile touched her lips for a fleeting second. It was the most devastating expression he had ever seen. The smile said, "Of course you don't. You never have." She stopped signing. She looked around the library, her gaze sweeping over the towering shelves, the thousands of books. Then she walked to a nearby shelf, her fingers ghosting over the leather spines. She pulled one down, a slim volume bound in dark green leather. She brought it back to the table, opened it, and pushed it towards him. It was a book of poetry. The page was open to a poem about a shipwreck, about a lone survivor clinging to a piece of driftwood in an endless, hostile sea. He read the lines, and a cold dread washed over him. She then went to another shelf and pulled down a heavy medical text, an anatomical atlas. She flipped through the pages until she found a diagram of the human throat, the larynx, the vocal cords. She pointed to the delicate structures, then pointed to the scar on her own neck. The message was brutally, devastatingly clear. This is what you took from me. My voice. She wasn't finished. She moved through the library like a phantom, gathering books. A history of the Gaul Wars. A treatise on psychological trauma. A book of local folklore that told tales of girls who were stolen and brutalized by monsters in the woods. She laid them all out on the table, an arsenal of silent testimony. Each book was a piece of her story, a story she could not speak but was determined to make him understand. And then she did the last thing he expected. She went to her portfolio and took out a fresh sheet of vellum and a piece of charcoal. She sat down, and for the first time, she began to draw. Her hand moved with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. Lines and shadows bloomed on the page. It was the cottage. The one from his memories, with the thatched roof and the wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Then, her hand moved again, and the drawing began to change. She added darker, harsher lines. Flames licking at the roof. The grotesque, hunched shapes of ghouls swarming the door. It was all there. The horror of that night, rendered in charcoal and pain. He stood frozen, watching her recreate the scene of his damnation. He felt a desperate urge to look away, to flee the room, to retreat back into the cold, safe numbness he had inhabited for a century. But he couldn't. Her eyes, her hands, her silence, they held him captive. She finished the drawing of the attack. Then she flipped the vellum over. On the clean side, she began to draw again. This time, it was a face. Her face. But it was the face of the 17-year-old girl he remembered. Young, unmarred, full of a light he had extinguished. Beneath the portrait, she drew a pair of hands. They were cupped together, and from them, a stream of musical notes, a song, floated upwards. Finally, she put the charcoal down. She pushed the vellum across the table to him. On one side, the inferno. On the other, the memory of a song. The life that was, and the horror that had replaced it. It was more than just a story. It was a bill. A reckoning. And as he stared at the charcoal drawings, at the portrait of the girl he had loved and left to burn, he understood that his penance was not simply to feel guilty. His penance was to learn to see. His penance was to stay in this room, surrounded by the silent, screaming testimony of her survival, and force himself, for the first time, to truly look at what he had done. He had to learn the language of her pain, even if it took him another eternity. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Ilara did not leave the citadel. She had been commissioned to complete the survey of the entire kingdom, a task that would take months, perhaps even a year. Kaelan decreed that she would work from the royal library. He cleared a large alcove for her, furnishing it with the finest mapmaker's tables, inks, and vellum. It was a gilded cage, a place where he could keep her close, where he could observe the quiet, steady cadence of her life. He began to spend his days there, too. He abandoned the throne room, delegating his more tedious duties to his council. He told them he was researching ancient treaties, a plausible excuse that his court accepted without question. But he did not read the treaties. He watched Ilara. From across the vast, silent library, he observed her. He learned the way she bit her lower lip when a line was proving difficult, the way she would pause and stare into the middle distance, her mind clearly charting landscapes he could not see. He learned the small, precise gestures of her work, the gentle tapping of a charcoal stick to shed its excess dust, the patient blotting of wet ink, the whisper of vellum as she unrolled a new sheet. Her existence was a universe of quiet, meticulous detail. And he watched her hands. When she was not working, her hands were rarely still. They would flutter to her throat, a self-soothing gesture she seemed unaware of. They would drum a silent, complex rhythm on the edge of her table. And sometimes, when she thought she was alone, he would see her signing to herself a fleeting story, a passing thought, a conversation with a ghost. He knew he could not live in this state of ignorant proximity forever. Watching her was a form of self-flagellation, but it was not penance. Penance required action. It required the effort to understand. He summoned Lucian, the old court translator. The ancient vampire arrived in the library, his movements slow and deliberate, his dark eyes holding a deep, weary wisdom. "Your Majesty," Lucian said, his voice a dry whisper. "You will teach me," Kaelan said, his voice quiet but firm. He did not need to elaborate. Lucian's eyebrows, thin and white as spider silk, rose a fraction of an inch. Sign language, my king? It is a complex art. It takes mortals years to master. I am not a mortal. And I have time, Kaelan replied, his gaze fixed on Alara's distant form, a slash of blue in the warm, amber light of the library. Lucian nodded slowly. As you wish. And so, the lessons began. Every night, after Alara had retired to the chambers he had assigned her, chambers overlooking the quietest part of the castle gardens, Kaelan would meet Lucian in the empty library. The first lessons were humbling, excruciating. His fingers, so accustomed to the unthinking certainty of holding a sword or a scepter, were clumsy, stiff. The shapes felt alien, the movements awkward. Lucian was a patient teacher. He would shape Kaelan's fingers with his own cool, dry hands. No, Majesty. The thumb must be tucked. It changes the meaning from mother to danger. Kaelan struggled. The language was not just a collection of gestures, it was a way of thinking. It was spatial, visual, its grammar woven into the direction of a glance, the speed of a movement, the expression on one's face. It was a language of the body, and his body had been trained for centuries to be an impassive, unreadable fortress. To learn this new language, he had to learn to be expressive, to be vulnerable, to let his face and his posture speak. He had to dismantle himself. He learned the basics first. Simple nouns, book, table, fire, moon. Then verbs, read, write, walk, see. He practiced for hours, his hands aching with the unfamiliar effort, until the movements began to feel less like a clumsy imitation and more like a nascent thought. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into his lessons, he was sitting at his table, ostensibly reading, but secretly practicing the sign for tree under the cover of his desk. Alara, from her alcove, dropped a bottle of ink. It shattered on the stone floor, a splash of midnight blue against the pale grey. She made a small, frustrated sound, not a word, but a sharp exhalation of breath. Before he could think, Kaelan was on his feet and crossing the room. He knelt, picking up the larger shards of glass while a servant, summoned by the noise, rushed to clean the spill. Alara was standing over the mess, her hands clenched, her face a mask of frustration. He looked up at her from his kneeling position. He saw the ink staining the hem of her tunic. Without thinking, he lifted his hand and made the signs. "Are you hurt?" It was a simple phrase. For small, clumsy movements. His hands trembled slightly with the effort, with the fear of getting it wrong. She stared at his hand, her eyes wide with shock. The frustration on her face dissolved, replaced by a profound, stunned stillness. She had not expected this. He could see the storm of questions in her eyes. How? Why? Slowly, as if moving through water, she lifted her own hand. She shook her head, a small, sharp movement. Then, she signed a single word. No. It was the first time they had spoken. The first time he had asked a question and she had given an answer. The air between them crackled with the weight of that one small word. It was a bridge, fragile and tenuous, built across a chasm of 100 years of silence. He stood up, the shards of glass still in his hand. He didn't know what to say next. His vocabulary was too small, his understanding too shallow. He could ask if she was hurt, but he could not ask if she was all right. He could name the ink, but he could not speak of the frustration. So he said nothing more. He simply nodded, gave the glass shards to the waiting servant, and returned to his table. But the library was no longer the same. The silence was different now. It was no longer an absence of sound. It was a space filled with the potential for conversation, a canvas waiting for the shape of words. He threw himself into his lessons with a new ferocity. He moved beyond simple nouns and verbs. He learned adjectives, sad, angry, beautiful, lost. He learned concepts, yesterday, forever, memory, regret. Each new sign was a key, unlocking another small part of the world she inhabited. One evening, he gathered his courage. He waited until the library was empty save for the two of them. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alara was packing up her things for the night, her movements tired but graceful. He walked over to her alcove. She looked up, startled, as he entered her space. He stopped a few feet away, giving her room. He took a breath and began to sign. "I want to tell you why I left." His hands were slow, deliberate. He had practiced the phrase 100 times with Lucian, but now, in front of her, he felt like an illiterate child sounding out his first sentence. She watched his hands, her expression unreadable. She did not respond immediately. She finished tying the leather straps of her portfolio, her movements precise, giving her time to think. Finally, she turned to face him fully. She nodded once. An invitation. A concession. Permission. He began to tell her the story. It was a halting, fragmented narrative, limited by his still fledgling grasp of the language. He used the signs he knew, and for the things he could not say, he used maps and books and gestures. He pulled down a political map of Ethel as it was then, showing her the borders, the disputed territories. He pointed to the lands ruled by the vampire Lord Malika, a cruel and ambitious rival. He signed. War was coming. Malika wanted to burn the human lands. This one. He placed his finger on the region that included Silverwood. All of it. He then found a book of royal lineages. He opened it to his own family tree, and then to Malika's. He pointed to Malika's daughter, a pale, stern-faced woman in a formal portrait. He signed, to stop the war, a marriage. He tapped his own name, then drew a line connecting it to hers. A king's duty. Save thousands. I chose, the kingdom. He looked at her, his hands falling to his sides. It was a bald, inadequate explanation. A king's cold calculus laid bare. He did not offer it as an excuse, but as a confession. This was the choice he had made. This was the man he had been. Elara listened, her eyes never leaving his face, his hands. Her expression was still, but he could see the faint tremor in her own hands, the only sign of the turmoil within. When he was finished, a long silence descended. The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. She stepped forward, her eyes searching his. She lifted her hands, and her signs were not angry or accusatory. They were sharp, clear, a series of questions that cut him to the core. You chose them, over me. You thought a village was worth more than a promise. He had no answer. Because the truth, the horrible, selfish truth that he had never admitted even to himself, was that he hadn't been thinking of the thousands of faceless subjects. He had been thinking of her. He had married Malika's daughter to prevent a war that he knew would begin with her village. He had sacrificed his life with her to save her life. He had tried to protect her by leaving her. It was a paradox of love and duty, a twisted logic that had resulted in a catastrophe. He tried to explain this. His hands fumbled, the signs inadequate. To save you. The war, it would start, here. He pointed again to Silverwood on the map. I left, to protect you. A single, silent tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Her face crumpled, not in anger, but in a wave of sorrow so profound it stole his breath. She signed, her hands trembling violently now. You protected me, by abandoning me. You left me alone, for the monsters. And there it was. The flaw in his grand, kingly plan. He had protected her from a war, only to leave her to a slaughter. He had traded one monster for another. He could not speak. He could not sign. He could only stand there as the full, devastating weight of her words settled upon him. He had not been a king making a hard choice. He had been a fool, blinded by a desperate, clumsy love, and his foolishness had cost her everything. He reached out, a reflexive, desperate gesture, wanting to comfort her, to hold her, but he stopped himself. He had forfeited that right a long, long time ago. All he could do was watch her cry, her silent sobs shaking her small frame, and know that he was the author of every single one of her tears. The library, once his sanctuary, had become a courtroom, and he had just been handed his sentence, to live forever with the knowledge that he had destroyed the very person he had tried to save. The confession hung in the air between them for weeks, a living entity. Elara did not flee. She continued her work with the same quiet diligence, but the space around her had changed. It was no longer just a place of quiet sorrow, It was now charged with the raw, exposed nerves of a truth finally spoken. The fragile bridge they had built with their first signed words had not collapsed, but it now swayed precariously over a much deeper, darker chasm. Kaelin retreated into himself. Her last signed words, "You left me alone for the monsters," played on a ceaseless loop in his mind. He redoubled his efforts with Lucian, driven now by a frantic urgency. He no longer wanted just to communicate, he wanted to understand nuance, to grasp the subtleties of her language, to be able to articulate the depth of his remorse in a way that went beyond his clumsy, fragmented sentences. He started to see the world through the lens of her language. He noticed the way light fell across a page and thought of the sign for hope. He saw a bird take flight outside the library window and thought of the sign for freedom. Her world, a world of visual poetry, was slowly bleeding into his own monochromatic existence. He began leaving things for her on her work table. Small, silent offerings. A rare pigment from the east that he knew she favored for her maps. A perfectly preserved autumn leaf, the color of her hair. A book of ancient cartography he'd found deep in the archives, its pages filled with fantastical sea monsters and imagined continents. He never waited for a reaction. He would leave the object in the pre-dawn hours and watch from a distance as she discovered it. Her reactions were always the same. She would stop, her hand hovering over the object. A look of complex, guarded emotion would cross her face, surprise, confusion, perhaps a flicker of something softer. Then she would simply nod to herself, a small, private acknowledgement, and place the item carefully to one side before resuming her work. She did not reject the gifts, but she did not embrace them either. They were facts to be noted, data points in the new, strange equation of their relationship. One afternoon, he found her staring out the window, her work forgotten. She was looking at a group of children playing in the courtyard below, their spoken laughter too distant to hear. Her expression was one of profound, aching loneliness. He saw her lift a hand, as if to wave, then let it fall. In that moment, he saw not just the woman she was, but all the women she had not been allowed to be. A wife. A mother. A woman whose laughter could be heard. The sight broke through his careful, academic approach to her language. This wasn't about grammar or vocabulary. It was about connection. It was about bridging the desolate island of her isolation. That night, he did not wait for his lesson with Lucian. He went to her. He found her in the castle garden, a place she often walked after her work was done. She was standing by a fountain, its water frozen into a delicate sculpture of ice, her breath pluming in the cold night air. She turned as he approached, her posture immediately wary. He stopped a respectful distance away, the frozen fountain between them. The moon was full, casting a brilliant, sterile light over the snow-dusted garden. He raised his hands, the cold making his fingers feel stiff. "I am sorry." The signs were simple, the first two he had truly mastered. But he poured a century of regret into them. He shaped the words with his hands, his face, his entire body, hoping she would see the truth of them. She watched him, her head tilted slightly. Her own hands remained at her sides. He continued, the words coming more easily now, a torrent of confession. "I was a fool. I was afraid. I thought I was strong, a king. But I was weak. My choice, it was not noble. It was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. It broke you. And it broke me." He let his hands fall, the confession leaving him feeling hollowed out, utterly exposed. He had said it. The truth. He had no excuses, no justifications. Only the stark, ugly fact of his failure. Ilara stood motionless for a long time. The only sound was the sigh of the wind through the bare branches of the rose bushes. He thought she would turn and walk away, leaving him alone with his shame. But she didn't. Instead, she finally lifted her hands. Her movements were slow, measured, each gesture carved with deliberate weight. "Broken things can be mended," she signed. "But they are never the same. The cracks remain." She then pointed to her chest, to her own heart. "I have learned to live with my cracks." Then, she pointed to him. "You must learn to live with yours." It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something more profound. It was acceptance. an acknowledgement that they were two broken people, shattered by the same event, and that their only path forward was to accept the pieces they had become. He felt a profound shift inside him. The raging fire of his guilt did not go out, but it banked, transforming from a destructive inferno into a steady, warming flame. It was the fire of purpose. He would not try to erase the cracks. He would learn their shape. He would honor them. He took a step closer, moving around the fountain. He stopped in front of her. He did not try to touch her. He simply looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time without the filter of his own guilt. He saw the strength in her quiet resilience, the intelligence in her perceptive eyes, the fierce, defiant beauty of her survival. He signed, "Will you teach me?" He held up his hands, showing her his own clumsy instruments. Not just the words. "Teach me to see." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first one he had ever seen, and it was like watching the sun rise after a century of night. It transformed her face, chasing the shadows from her eyes. She nodded. "Yes," she signed. "The lessons will begin now." She turned and pointed to the moon, a perfect white disk in the sky. She made the sign for it, a C-shape formed by her thumb and index finger, moving in an arc. He copied her. Then she pointed to a star, and signed the word, her index fingers brushing against each other as they moved upwards. He copied that, too. They stood there for over an hour in the frozen garden, under the silent watch of the moon and stars, and she gave him his first real lesson. She taught him the names for the winter constellations, for the different kinds of snow, for the feeling of cold on the skin. She did not just teach him words, she taught him her world. It was the beginning. Not an ending, and not a return to what was lost, but the slow, deliberate foundation of something new. A language built of patience and shared sorrow. A connection forged not in spite of the cracks, but because of them. He was a king, and she was a cartographer, but in that moonlit garden, they were simply two souls learning to map the difficult, uncharted territory of the human heart, one silent, hopeful gesture at a time. Their shared history was a landscape of ruins, but here, in the quiet cold, they had found a place to start rebuilding. The library transformed from a place of silent observation into a classroom. Their days fell into a new pattern. Ilara would work on her maps, and Kaelin would sit nearby, studying the sign language texts Lucian provided. But now, when he had a question, he would not wait for his nightly lesson. He would approach her alcove, and she would pause her work, her eyes patient, and show him the correct hand shape, the proper facial grammar. She was a demanding teacher. She would not let him be lazy. If his expression was flat while signing the word for joy, she would tap her own smiling lips and raise her eyebrows, waiting for him to mirror her. If his movements were too sharp when signing gentle, she would soften his hands with her own, guiding his fingers into a more fluid motion. Her touch was light, professional, yet every time her skin brushed against his, it felt like a brand. He learned that her silence was not empty. It was rich and textured. He began to understand her moods not by words, but by the way she moved. The quick, efficient sweep of her hand across a map meant she was focused, content. A slight, repetitive rubbing of her thumb against her forefinger meant she was troubled. He was learning the language of her body, a dialect more intimate than any spoken tongue. Through their silent conversations, he began to learn the story of her life. She told him how she had survived that night. She had hidden in the root cellar, listening to the screams and the sounds of destruction above. She told him of the years after, of being found by a traveling order of silent monks who taught her their language of hands and gave her a new life. They were the ones who had discovered her talent for cartography, for seeing the world and rendering it with beautiful precision. She never spoke of the attack with self-pity. She presented the facts of her life as she would the topography of a mountain range, with clarity, precision, and a kind of detached respect for the forces that had shaped her. But Kaelin saw the pain beneath the surface. He saw it in the way she would pause her story, her hands hovering in the air as a memory became too sharp. He saw it in the shadows that would sometimes gather in her eyes. In turn, he told her of his own life. Of the cold, lonely years on the throne. Of his loveless, political marriage to Malachus' daughter, who had died of ennui a half-century ago. He told her of the burdens of kingship, not to garner sympathy, but to show her the cage he had built for himself. He confessed that, in all his centuries, she was the only one he had ever truly. He paused, unable to find the sign for the word he meant. She supplied it for him. Her hands formed a simple, elegant shape over her heart. Love. He looked at the sign, then at her face. He nodded, the admission a weight lifting from his soul. Yes. A blush crept up her neck, a surprising splash of color against her pale skin. She looked away, towards the fire, but not before he saw the flicker of some old, buried warmth in her eyes. Their connection deepened, moving beyond teacher and student. They began to share meals in the library, eating in comfortable silence. He would read to her, his voice low, while she worked, and she would watch the way his mouth formed the words, a strange, wistful expression on her face. One evening, she showed him something she had been working on in secret. It was not one of her official maps. It was a personal project. A star chart. But it was unlike any he had ever seen. She had used crushed lapis for the deep blue of the night sky, and flecks of real silver for the stars. And the constellations were not the traditional ones named for gods and heroes. They were new constellations, of her own making. She pointed to one, a graceful arc of stars. The survivor, she signed. Another, a tight cluster, was the secret. A long, winding river of silver dust was the unspoken. It was a map of her soul, laid bare in silver and blue. He felt a profound sense of reverence, as if he had been allowed into the most sacred of spaces. He pointed to a small, solitary star, set slightly apart from the others. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. The king, she signed, a faint, sad smile on her lips. His heart, a long dormant organ, gave a painful throb. To be on her map, even as a distant, lonely star, was a greater honor than any crown. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He wanted to tell her that he didn't want to be a solitary star anymore. He wanted to be part of her constellations. He wanted to be the branch next to her leaf, the river that flowed to her sea. But the words were too new, too fragile. Instead, he simply traced the shape of her constellation, the survivor, in the air. Then he looked at her and signed, beautiful. Their quiet world could not remain untouched forever. The court, ever watchful, had noticed the king's obsession with the silent cartographer. Whispers followed them down the corridors. His council grew concerned by his neglect of state affairs. A delegation, led by a stern old vampire named Lord Valerus, confronted him one morning in the library. Your Majesty, Valerus began, his tone laced with disapproval, the kingdom requires its king. These historical studies are consuming you. He cast a disdainful glance towards Alara's alcove. Kaelin turned to face him, his eyes cold as a winter sky. My studies are my own concern, my lord. The kingdom is stable. For now, Valerus countered. But your behavior is causing unrest. There are rumors. An unnatural attachment to a mortal commoner. It speaks of weakness. Before Kaelin could unleash the icy wrath that had felled stronger men than Valerus, Alara stepped out of her alcove. She walked to stand beside Kaelin, her posture erect, her gaze steady. She looked directly at Valerus, a man whose power made most in the court tremble, and she showed no fear. She lifted her hands and began to sign, her movements sharp and precise as a blade. Kaelin translated for her, his voice ringing with a pride that startled even himself. She says that true weakness is not attachment, but the fear of it. She says the king is not studying history. He is learning a language. And in doing so, he is learning more about this kingdom and its people than he ever did from the throne. Valerus was taken aback, both by her audacity and by the king's passionate defense. He stared at Alara's moving hands, then at Kaelin's face. He saw something there he had not seen in a century, not the cold monument of a king, but the fierce, protective fire of a man. Valerus bowed stiffly. As you say, Majesty. He and his delegation retreated, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Kaelin turned to Alara. She was looking down at her own hands, as if surprised by their boldness. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand in his. Her skin was cool, her fingers strong from her work. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her ink-stained knuckles. He looked into her eyes and signed, "Thank you." She squeezed his hand, a small, firm pressure. "We protect our own," she signed back. "We." The word echoed in the quiet library, a promise and a declaration. They were no longer a king and his subject, a monster and his victim. They were a we. A constellation of 2 stars, no longer solitary, beginning to trace a new pattern in the vast, dark sky. The cracks were still there, they would always be there, but now, they were beginning to let the light shine through.